Viewers, you're watching The Hard Facts, the most credible show at prime time. And let me tell you that the biggest story with global implications is unfolding even as we speak in Kazan, Russia. This is a massive story, viewers, and it deserves to be center stage at 9 p.m. on the most watched channel, on the most watched show, viewers. There are several messages being beamed out of the Kazan chapter of the BRICS Summit, where Russian President Vladimir Putin has pulled out all the stops to host world leaders from a growing list of more than 20 nations. You can see those pictures. The first among these is that a new non-West age of global diplomacy is finally taking credible shape. Global diplomacy, viewers. This is clear from the fact that more countries are preparing to invest and even risk tremendous amounts of diplomatic capital by joining a grouping that defines itself as an alternative to a United States-dominated Western global order. This is a far cry from 2009, when BRICS comprised of only 5 members and it got going in a very low-key fashion. Then the world was a very different place. The United States was the undisputed hegemon, with few ready to challenge its superiority. The US had, after all, decimated Afghanistan and Iraq, and everyone seemed to buy into the Washington scripted righteous spin given to the twin invasions. They said they were doing it for a just cause. But then, viewers, soon after the US betrayed the trust of the world, reports emerged that beyond the declared wars, it was pursuing several alleged, quote, secret wars, unquote, as part of its global war on terror and under a, quote, strained interpretation of constitutional self-defense, unquote. In other words, viewers, it was carrying out illegal insurgencies, propping up various insurgents and affecting regime change. It continues to do that, viewers, of course, we know that. It does it even in Bangladesh, as recently as 2 months ago. That's what is said. Now, some in the global south even trace the roots of antagonism that resulted in the Ukraine conflict to this kind of adventurism. In fact, the Ukraine war and the weaponization of sanctions by the United States can be credited for driving the growth of BRICS from a club of 5 countries to 9, with at least 3 dozen more nations keen to join. Putin says there are 30 knocking on the doors. Each of these, including some US allies like Thailand, etc., have reasons to be anxious of untrammeled US-led Anglosphere's hegemony. Second, viewers, the second big message, that the growing BRICS bloc that is beginning to display greater diversity can better drive consensus on a myriad of concerns afflicting the global south than a smaller grouping seemingly dominated by China's priorities. Up until the BRICS was restricted to a 5-nation bloc, members like South Africa and India were wary of the Russo-Chinese attempt at turning the grouping into an anti-West axis. This fear meant that the bloc couldn't unite behind its original purpose of being the pivot for reforming global governance. Now, with more members and greater diffusion of expectations, the bloc can reflect the more reformist reasons for which it was forged in the first place. Third message coming out of Kazan: the expanded BRICS Plus, some experts think, will also allow the forum's members to apply collective pressure on the US-led West, that it needs to do more to win the trust of the global south. Viewers, you know what has been happening with the US deep state, propping up various kinds of individuals. I don't need to go into that. A world where the West is more responsive to the views, concerns, and needs of the global south can only be a better one. Of course, there will be many cynics who may continue to write off BRICS as an incohesive bloc addled by inherent contradictions and rivalries amongst its constituents. Some of this is true, but viewers, it is also being said that these naysayers will be doing so at their own risk. Many other groupings like the G7 and G20, not to mention several UN fora, also grapple with their own internal divisions. In the end analysis, the biggest message from Kazan might simply be that BRICS Plus is here to stay and that the US-led West's hegemony might finally be waning. It might finally have a challenger. Let's open this up, viewers. We have some stellar experts to talk a little bit about this reshaping, this credible reshaping of what we are seeing in Kazan. And I want to first begin with senior journalist who joins me from Moscow in Russia. And she's been speaking on these issues, writing about them. Ms. Kukreva, thank you very much for speaking to CNN News 18 tonight. I want to ask you, a lot of people are saying that we're seeing a redefinition of the global order where we can now see that whether we agree or not, that there is the beginning of the waning of the West. How do you respond to people who are saying these things? Do you believe this to be true?
Oh, I believe that what we're seeing today is extraordinary, truly extraordinary, because we see countries coming together, countries like India and China and Russia in the middle, that has relationships with both of those countries. These countries also coming together, to discuss the issues that need to be discussed, to further build on relationships that for some people, we've heard this for years, building up of this controversy that, that India and China have so many issues that they don't agree on. And yet we see a summit and we see an organization that keeps growing. I remember when BRICS just started and it was, it was just this small group of countries. And now today we have 36 countries coming together for a summit of the group that essentially, technically right now, it's 10 states. And yet we see a growing interest of states wanting to join into this dialogue, into this redefinition of international relations, if you want, if you know what I mean. It is an extraordinary alliance of states that have their vision, and they're not intimidated to talk about it to each other.
Right. Well, that's an interesting perspective coming straight out of Russia, Mr. Chileni. Let me ask you this. Does the growth of BRICS prove that more and more countries are now convinced that the US-led Anglosphere is perhaps on the decline, or quite frankly, doesn't sort of at any level respect their freedom, sovereignty, call it what you want to?
Both things are right, Rahul. BRICS is becoming a magnet to pluralize the global order. With the rise of new powers and the continuing decline of the West's share of the global GDP, the shifting balance of power is transforming global geopolitics and corroding the US-led economic order. Now, in place of one power dominating the world, a multipolar world is emerging. That is crystal clear. And as a new age of international relations dawns, the role of the non-Western world is assuming increasing importance. Against this background, the BRICS grouping, the BRICS is the world's first major non-US international initiative. That's what makes it important. BRICS today symbolizes the eroding dominance of the West, which accounts for just 12% of the global population. But as the West's power and influence decline, countries seeking to enlarge their strategic options are cozying up to new centers of power or to groupings like BRICS. BRICS represents, above all, a widespread yearning to pluralize the global order. That's the reason why, despite these unprecedented US-led sanctions against Russia, trying to isolate and squeeze Russia, 36 countries today are in Kazan at the BRICS Summit, showing the failure of the Western strategy to isolate any important player like Russia.
Okay. Sushant Sareen, let me bring you on this. As we speak, the BRICS GDP in terms of purchasing power parity, 2023 that is ahead of G7. India's own trading arrangement with BRIC partners, the volume of trade that is significantly higher than G7 and EU combined. But there are a lot of people who keep saying that, look, the more you sort of do business with BRICS, the more out of favor you will be with the more important partner in the West and the flotilla of democracies that you naturally are aligned towards. How do you respond to those cynics, those critics who say this?
So, Rahul, I think there's an element of truth in what they are saying, that, if the relationship with the BRICS countries or the relationship within the BRICS nations becomes very deep and to the detriment of our other trading partners, then of course there will be certain repercussions. And if of course there is a greater strategic alignment within the BRICS countries, then of course there will be certain repercussions. I think that's a no-brainer. We will see the West also trying to push us around a bit. Not that they don't do it otherwise, but that's something that, the West has been so used to its own exceptionalism that they think they can, it's still the same world which was there in the 1940s or maybe even 100 years before that. And the world has actually taken a turn. But again, I would also, when you drop these kind of numbers, I think you also need to break down those numbers and see where exactly that trade is coming from. If you remove India's trade with China, for example, and in the case of Russia, that trade volume has only grown because of the energy trade which is taking place between India and Russia. Before that, it was only around $14–15 billion, maybe even less, maybe around $10 billion. But after that, it's gone up to about $60–70 billion. So if you start breaking down those numbers and you start looking at the kind of engagements we have, whether it's with the BRICS countries or with the West, I think the nature of those engagements is vastly different. Of course, as BRICS expands, there will be a whole lot of other countries which will join in, with which we have very deep engagement, for example, in the Middle East. Yeah. But at the same time, I think it is important to understand that, we don't really want to take any sides. We want to have our strategic options open up, but it's not as though, and I think the Indian side has made it very clear, it's not that we are anti-West, but we are not West. And we don't want to be pushed around by the West to take certain positions or to fight their wars for them. We don't want to do that. We don't expect the West to fight our wars for us. We don't want to fight their wars for them. So I think we need to be very clear about where we are going to go with it, especially because, and Rahul, this is critical, that as of now, while there are a lot of people making a beeline for BRICS, what exactly is the framework within which the BRICS operates? Apart from the BRICS Bank and a couple of other things, what is that big framework within which BRICS is now going to be a leading bloc of nations, which will be a kind of, alternative to the Western dominated world order? And I think there is no clarity on that as yet. Until that clarity comes, until there is a certain deepening of the relationships, and some of the more, the bigger problems, for example, between India and China, as long as they stay on the table, I don't see how we can get in very deep with this grouping.
Well, we'll unpack all of this. Let me bring in Mr. Wagma. Mr. Wagma, thank you very much for speaking to me. I want to continue the thread. And I want to ask you, has the West's overreach and adventurism led to a backlash? And that backlash is now crystallizing in the growth, in the membership of BRICS. Clearly, the Prime Minister's enthusiastic support for Putin is also a clear message to the United States. And I'm talking about Prime Minister Modi. And of course, the MEA is holding a press conference. We'll go to it in just a few moments once we understand what the salient points are. But Mr. Wagma, this is a concern.
speaking of the word concern, I'm glad you took the words from my mouth, Rahul. And when the MEA conference opens up in a few minutes, I do hope there's some progress on those 9 Indian cadavers returning from Russia who were forcibly pressed into the Ukraine war, and which India has been pretty tactful about and not discussed. Not to mention the Kerala State Minister, who has time and again brought it up with the Indian Foreign Secretary, of scores of Keralites who have gone to fight in Ukraine and against Ukraine and have taken up Russian permanent residency, having been given that by Moscow, having had a change of heart, now wish to return home. Why is Moscow dragging its feet on that with such an evergreen ally as New Delhi is? And let's really talk money, Rahul, even putting those aspects and other such sentimentality aside. Though, of course, there is a human element to it with those who died and were tricked into dying, taken in by these manpower agencies from Dubai, ostensibly to work in Russia. Why are Indian public sector units, Oil India, ONGC Videsh, Bharat Petroleum, etc., stuck and not receiving their $900 million PSU dividends in Russian banks? And they are held in rubles. They're not held in foreign currency. But the fact that a paltry 900 million has time and again been brought up by Indian dealers through the Indian ministries, but Russia drags its feet in not remitting them. But then that would make sense, Rahul, given that this very month, October 2024, Russia was reduced to bartering, which it has been doing for quite a while with North Korea for horses and all that sort of stuff, straight out of the early medieval era. This very month, Russia imported citrus fruits from Pakistan, and guess what they exported to Pakistan in return? Dal and chana, chickpeas and lentils. So that's what we are talking about where Russia is. And as regards this BRICS forum that we're talking about, since June 2009 and its inception, I haven't seen a formal secretariat or a constitution evolve. 15 years on, you don't have a basic office and mechanism, rules and protocol in place. I repeat, there is no secretariat in place. There is no trade mechanism in place. At the Johannesburg summit, there was talk of a BRICS common currency. Nothing has come of it despite blandishments in the declaration. And what has happened after 2015 is the NDB New Development Bank offered up as an alternative to the Bretton Woods IMF system, which is Shanghai-based and yuan-based. And I cannot for the life of me see India wanting to adopt yuan-based transactions in times to come. Some others would, like Bangladesh and others who have joined the NDB, but not India as such. And of course, yuan-based renminbi transactions also involve, needless to state, Chinese-style authoritarian capitalistic characteristics of governance. And I don't think the world's largest democracy after 78 years would be particularly enthused about doing so.
So your point being what? You've listed all these examples. You're saying that these are insincere partners, Russia, China.
That BRICS, like SCO last week, remains a talking shop, but there is some merit, I repeat, some merit, Rahul, in being in the room than outside the room, because India does enjoy a complicated set of multilateral relationships with several countries.
It's interesting, Mr. Burzin Wagma, that you should make this point about Russia being insincere. Let me tell you what the EAM said yesterday, the External Affairs Minister. He says,
I heard it.
Russia has never, ever, ever gone against Indian interests. And here you are seeming to suggest that, look, they exploited our soldiers and they're not giving us back our soldiers, etc., etc. Are you suggesting that countries that, okay, so are you suggesting citizens, are you suggesting that countries like the United States that turn a blind eye to Indian concerns over separatism have funded both Pakistan and other Indian enemies in the past, have sort of even brought in their big fleet to dissuade India from liberating Bangladesh, etc., more dependable allies? I'm not understanding what you're getting at.
10 years before the USS Enterprise came to the Bay of Bengal, as you just referred to, in '62, it was Kennedy who saved India's skin in the Sino-Indian conflict by airlifting arms and armaments. Right. For some reason, Indians have amnesia and don't talk about '62. And October '62, Rahul, is when the war commenced with China. In July '62, Khrushchev reneged on supplying MiG-21 aircrafts, which he had promised in the first instance. An MOU had been signed, and in July '62, he pulled the carpet. And of course, as Indira Gandhi once said, nations have constant interests, not constant allies and partners. It stands to reason that Russia and Pakistan have been conducting Druzhba military games exercises since 2016 too.
Okay.
And of course, so the point is, it's a talking shop.
It's a talking shop
and intents.
of vipers, if they could talk, that is. Brahma Chileni.
Well, I don't know where to begin after the last intervention, but let me remind the viewers that BRICS is an informal multilateral organization like the G20, the G7, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. None of these bodies has a permanent secretariat or a charter. So nobody has ever thought of a charter for BRICS because BRICS was not designed to be a formal institution like NATO. NATO is a charter-based formal institution. G7, G20, SCO, BRICS are informal multilateral institutions. So the fact that there's no permanent secretariat and no charter is what makes BRICS relevant to today's world. And as far as the new development bank is concerned, which is the BRICS Bank, this is the only multilateral lending organization in which its founding members have equal rights and equal vote. They're equal shareholders in the new development bank, the 4 founding members, which is India, China, Brazil, and Russia. By contrast, World Bank, take the World Bank. The US is the dominant shareholder of the World Bank and holds a veto power. And the new development bank certainly is not a yuan-based lending institution. What it does is very important, and this is only one step of how BRICS can create institutions. The only unfortunate part about the new development bank is that the idea was conceived by India, but China grabbed it, and it's now headquartered in Shanghai. But I think the broader issue that we have to keep in mind is that the Western decisions to weaponize finance and seize interest earned on frozen Russian central bank assets have caused deepening disquiet in the non-Western world, helping to build support in BRICS to explore alternative arrangements, including new cross-border payment mechanisms that are invulnerable to political pressures or interventions. Some countries are reassessing their heavy reliance on the US dollar in international transactions and reserve holdings. All this could aid the larger efforts to create non-Western mechanisms and arrangements. And I think that we should not minimize what BRICS is seeking to do. The BRICS is, of course, riven with internal divisions, so is the G7. But today, the BRICS is seen internationally as a credible alternative to the G7. We should not forget, I think, as you mentioned,
let me bounce that off. That's a very good point, because that leads me straight into the question. Is BRICS now perfectly poised? I'm saying it's not there. Poised to at least pose a challenge to the West's hegemony? That's the question I want to come back to with both Sushant Sareen, Ms. Kukareva, as well as Wagmar. So let me start with you, Wagmar, because you kicked the, you sort of kicked the ball out of the park, so to speak, by saying that it's a talk shop. But here's the question for you. It's poised to challenge the West's hegemony. Why is the West feeling so insecure? I mean, I sense that there is a certain amount of skepticism because it sort of arises out of a feeling of perhaps, I don't know, some sort of chastened righteousness, so to speak. I don't know. Explain.
It's not for the West to decide what these countries decide to do in the Global South. It is for the Global South to realize that ultimately it comes down to a Chinese show. And do you want a world run on Chinese cynic-style governance and a yuan-based economy? It really does come down to that. And I don't see India enthusiastic about it. Maybe others are. Sino-Russian oil deals are happening in yuan. Sino-Iranian oil deals are happening in yuan, true. Perhaps even Sino-Bangladesh down the line. But the point is that do you want to see a world order led by Beijing rather than traditionally by DC and London, which for all its demerits and faults, and there are one too many blemishes to talk about,
are you saying that the US is concerned of the Chinese taking over the global south and sort of infusing it with a bunch of, cynical sort of practices, ideologies, etc. Is that what you're saying?
No, what I am saying is that it is cynic characteristics of governance and authoritarian capitalism that are being offered by the Chinese model.
Who feeds to such an extent the capitalist enterprise of China? It's America. How much have you actually reduced in total absolute trade terms your trade with China?
Or India, for that matter, which is completely in half to China.
Forget India for the moment.
But the point remains that
I'm asking you, the West does so much business with China. Even now, it's over leveraged. So, in what way are you sort of punishing, for the lack of a better word, China? I see that there is a certain dissonance here between what you hope to say and what the West is doing.
Well, the cognitive dissonance is that in the global south, that for a variety of reasons, and there are individual nationalist or strategic reasons, that they cannot bring themselves to criticize the Ukrainian war. And that, yes, there have been other wars and the West has been hypocritical. But the ramifications of that have become evident.
The West walked out of Afghanistan, viewers. America walked out of Afghanistan and they left a hole this big of jihadis running amok.
Yes, and what is happening in Guyana as we speak?
I don't remember
with Venezuela.
I don't remember Russia. One second. Let's just open this up.
No, I'm talking about Prigozhin and Russia and West Africa. You should speak to the
Look,
Niger
I'm only saying,
and
viewers,
Mauritanians.
I agree with you. I'm only saying, viewers, that India needs to have many friends. It can't just find itself being squeezed and muscled into the West because the West think that India will be this cat's paw and they want to work India up so that we can constantly be sort of at loggerheads with China. In fact, that situation might also ease itself. Okay, a big breaking news coming in. The Modi-Xi bilateral, just talking about China and improving ties, which will also, of course, at some level deprive the West of leverage, is taking place tomorrow. This is a massive development, viewers. Very, very big development. The Modi-Xi meeting at BRICS will happen on Wednesday. This formally breaks the ice between the two countries. This meeting has not taken place at that level for a few years. If you remember, there were a large number of opposition parties in India who criticized Prime Minister Modi for shaking hands with Xi a few years back. In fact, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was in Southeast Asia. And they said you didn't show him, quote unquote, la lang. Now, viewers, with a bit of a thaw, these two leaders are back. This is very significant, as I was saying. And I want to bring in Sushant Sareen for some quick perspective on this. I'll bring you in, Ms. Kukreva, in just a few seconds. But Sushant Sareen, this is a big development. This meeting is taking place. It's been confirmed for tomorrow. I think it's happening in the afternoon.
So, Rahul, I think this meeting was being expected, once we announced that some kind of a deal has been struck on the border to bring down the tension and, some of the standoffs which are occurring in eastern Ladakh, that some of the outstanding issues have been sorted out. While I think we need to be careful to understand these are very tiny baby steps which have been taking place and a lot more needs to be done. I only wonder whether this meeting which takes place tomorrow is just for optics, or does this actually, or has something been worked out which will actually, give us some kind of a roadmap on how the two countries plan to address rest of the outstanding issues as far as the border management is concerned. And then, of course, is the larger issues. I don't think that is going to happen tomorrow. The larger issue of how India and China are going to reset their relationship and then take it forward. And I think that is going to be critical also from the point of view of BRICS. I agree with what Mr. Wagmar is saying, that look, if you want BRICS to be successful, number one, I think a comparison with G7 is odious. There is no comparison, simply because regardless of what we might say that it's informal, it's a club, say what you will about G7, the countries in the G7 very closely coordinate the economic policies and the strategic policies, right? And yes, America is the Chaudhary of that group. It calls the shots, but the others also get a say to it, in it. And they are willing allies of the Americans in that particular grouping. What will happen in the case of BRICS? Will India ever kowtow to China? Will India, for example, as Mr. Wagner asks the question, do we want a China-centric economic order in which the Chinese are going to be calling the shots? Forget about BRICS Bank, that everybody has an equal partnership or equal shareholding. But we know how the Chinese operate. Brahma, more than anybody else, knows how the Chinese operate. Do we want something like that? Are we going to be comfortable with it? And a whole lot of other countries which come in. So, yes, we have a very close relationship with Russia, a relationship which we value, a relationship which we would want to deepen even more. But, you know, if there is a China factor involved in this, and of course a couple of other countries, then there are going to be issues. There are going to be problems. So you cannot replicate the
Will there be
G7
more? Will there be greater? That's the fundamental question. Will they be greater than the ones that we have periodically also with the West, when they sort of morally lecture us, put sanctions when we tested a nuclear weapon, this, that, the other? Anyhow, I'll come to that one second. I just also want to bring in Ms. Kukreva. Ms. Kukreva, this question about the BRICS becoming really the workshop of China and China calling the shot. And therefore, we mustn't really, India mustn't really throw in its lot there and must perhaps subjugate its interest to a shop run by the Americans, because somehow the Americans are nicer and they are speak our language and this, that, the other. How do you respond to that?
Well, Rahul, this is certainly a very, it's just a classic example of actually American narrative that we're hearing from Mr. Wagmar. You know, the US, you know, I've been following US politics and covering US politics for years now. And the one thing that we need to understand is that they only always need an enemy. There has to be one, you know, scarecrow to scare everybody into kind of, you know, into submission, into alliance, take it as you please. So to discredit something, you only need to say, look, well, okay, BRICS, we've been laughing at it for several years. Now they're doing something and doing something extremely important. But look, China is dominating proceedings, because if you take China as something that you put out as the enemy here, then, you know, you kind of discredit the whole organization, which is exactly what I talked to you about in the very beginning. You know, the thing that is so extraordinary about BRICS bloc is the fact that these are countries who can come together, and who can come together as equals. We don't need one, you know, one enemy of the state to scare everybody else into submission. Let me give you some numbers. You know, while we're comparing BRICS to G7, which is, yes, it is an inevitable comparison, but let's not forget, G7 was formed in 1975.
Yeah.
It has been quite some years, you know, since then.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, you know, according to Russia's central bank, the exchanges in national currencies have gone up to 85% between BRICS countries. This is the most important thing, the only thing that we can talk about here, because we can talk about, you know, BRICS are on talk and no action, but the exchanges in national currencies that undermine the US dollar, severely undermine the US dollar, and the American hegemony on the international economic stage. This is extraordinary.
Right.
This is a completely different game we're playing here. You know, we can talk about BRICS not having a charter, not having a constitution, but this is not what it's about. You know, the UN has a charter. How much is India really represented and really listened to in the UN?
Well, that's a good point. I mean, that is a good point. I mean, you know, there are no arguments there. I think you've scored a great point. Okay.